This is San Francisco.
It's Toshio, and today I'm going to talk with Cole Clark about an article we co-wrote about how San Francisco's leather and LGBTQ district is a vehicle for gentrification. In San Francisco, we have the largest kink event in the U.S. every year at Folsom Street Fair. And partially because we have this culture of people not being ashamed of sex, the Bay Area is a very popular place to hate on by conservatives. Today's episode is about the local politics around sex and how the same bureaucracy put in place to preserve SF culture is helping to undermine that culture. The leather district was sold to people here as a way to salvage the kink culture in a large part of South of Market in the city as real estate and tech moguls and politicians at their command began gentrifying the neighborhood. And like with the Transgender District and other cultural districts in the city, the creation of a cultural district is sold to us as a way to save a culture. But as Paul Bowden of the Western Regional Advocacy Project told us as we were reporting this story, it's more like a, quote, gravestone on where a community used to live, end quote. While leather culture gets thrown a bone by the city and developers, like the commemorative bronze plaques on Ringgold Alley that have the names of people and leather history on them, the city and developers use the district as an inexpensive way to do public relations and colonize the area, essentially giving the leather districts these plaques or maybe a mural, and then the leather district becomes a way to streamline the process for real estate developers to go into a neighborhood and build housing that is affordable to no one who lives in the neighborhood, because the developer can say, look, we're getting no resistance from the leather cultural district, so the community clearly is on board with this idea. Meanwhile, most of the people who live in the area and who are, for the most part, unaware that luxury condos and the people who live in luxury condos are on the way to make life hell for them, there's not really a chance for them to push back, because a lot of this is being done under the auspices of these districts that speak on behalf of cultures. So you might be part of kink culture in San Francisco. You might go out to like kink parties, but there's a pretty good chance you've never heard of the leather districts. Know that they are going to speak on behalf of you, regardless of whether or not you are paying attention to what's going on at their meetings. And it's not a super conspiratorial system, I don't think, on the part of the leather district and many of the other districts, but it does end up screwing a lot of people over who would consider themselves part of these cultures. Cole, would you mind introing yourself?
My name's Cole. I am a special education paraprofessional in Chicago, but I spent all of my early 20s in San Francisco and the Bay Area more broadly.
Yeah, where we met. And the leather district, I think when we met, did not exist as a bureaucracy under the cultural districts that are part of the city now, city infrastructure. People can go back and listen to an explanation of the Transgender District, which is the first cultural district that San Francisco launched. So, Cole, I was wondering if you could speak to, from what we had researched back in 2018 when we initially put the piece out, and sort of what you know personally about the neighborhood, the kind of 10 blocks that makes up the leather district, and what existed in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s before the post-first .com boom. Gentrification entered the neighborhood. What did this neighborhood look like?
Yeah, totally. I remember I pulled a lot of like the thinking that I did on this from Gail Rubin's work, honestly, because there's not a ton of like mid-century gay specific work on this part of the city. A lot of it like follows around the beginning of like HIV and AIDS. But like one of the things I found most interesting was like leather culture is like in the city had like largely been a waterfront thing in the 50s, like for like post-war era. So it had like largely been like over by the Embarcadero and like near where like the old pre-fire like 19th century port was. But like one of the big things about the neighborhood was like it was like primarily like a manufacturing neighborhood for most of that time period. This is also like when the start of Filipino settlement started to happen there. Mainly because they were cheap, kind of semi-residential, like semi-converted housing within like the context of like studios and like old-fashioned studios, not like housing studios, but and like small manufacturing spaces that got really, I mean, and I think that that's like the larger like economic background of it is like as that stuff developed throughout the 60s, like when the first bars and baths opened up, like there was the Toolbox, there was Phoebe's, and then there was the Rich Street Bar, like baths, which were the first like kind of like big bathhouse in San Francisco that was like located in the area. A lot of that it was interesting because it was like by far like especially in the 20th century, it was like by far the most racially diverse, but it was also the spot where like we had been chatting a little bit before the recording started, about porn theaters in Times Square in the 60s and 70s. It had a very similar kind of flair to it. Like it's a place where like working class queer people could interact, but also have cross relations across class and racial lines in like gay and leather specific spaces. And so like the slow development of like leather and then more particularly like kink based cultures slowly kind of emerged out of that space. Obviously with like all the general caveats about like living under racial capitalism. But still, by the 80s, there were like, before most of the baths were closed down, like there were like over 30 establishments that catered specifically to like either leather or like gay sex related spaces within this like very tiny section of the city, directly south of Market. So it was like kind of the heart, after Polk Street, it was kind of like the heart of like gay alternative culture during most of like the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. I think the first big hit of like what was going to come to be the gentrification stuff was like kind of twofold. One was like a much longer project of like the slow destruction of like urban manufacturing in San Francisco, which was obviously like a much longer process. But that was like kind of the beginning of the displacement of like the clientele, either from like their work sites where like a lot of people would actually like come directly from work to these spaces because it was like a place away from home where you could kind of try out certain types of things, or you know, if you weren't out, or if you weren't gay in your private life or your domestic life, that was always an option. But as that slowly dried up, like I think a lot of it fell prey to a significant amount of like the broader disinvestment that occurred across like U.S. urban areas in like the 70s and 80s specifically. And then the second part was that during like the start of the HIV crisis in San Francisco, when all of the public baths were shut down, that was in the 80s. That was a really big hit to like the culture of the area because a significant number of like the big patronizing spaces that were not like just for the clubs and kink based stuff that were like explicitly sex oriented were located in the area.
Thanks for that overview of the history of the area. The Leather District was founded in 2018, and it's in this area that Cole described, and it's also where people who have been to SF might know the largest open air kink events in the country happen every year. Folsom Street Fair and Dory Alley, Up Your Alley Fest. And in 2018, though, there is a pretty frightening picture from June of that year that we can link in the show notes of 7 people in hard hats with black, blue, and red shovels, the colors of the leather pride flag, and they're posing at the groundbreaking of Eagle Plaza, a park dedicated to the kink community in Soma, and flanked by 2 guys in black leather outfits, or San Francisco's Mayor London Breed, and several other local politicians. plus representatives from a local subsidiary of the real estate multinational Greystar, which is, I believe, as Aaron McElroy mentioned in a recent episode, Greystar is the largest real estate housing conglomerate that exists globally. These politicians, they're gathered in front of the Eagle, which is this leather bar located across the plaza from what are now high-end apartments that are called HQ. And HQ's leasing office is currently offering empty apartments with no strings attached, free rent for months if you move in now. However, the offer of no strings attached free rent is kind of a lie because you have to be in a position to prove you have great credit and can pay about $4,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in HQ.
I don't know if you remember this, but what is now HQ is like it's like standard apartments. The initial plans that were submitted as part of like the early planning process, like during the stages in which the leather district was being developed and the Eagle Plaza kind of like nonprofit framework was being developed, that it was supposed to be like an 150 like micro unit apartment building. Like this was during the big push with like shared kitchens and stuff. Like, so they were actually like ideally marketing this initially towards like people who were either going to A, be transient, or B, be like micro co-living people. It was really dire. I mean, 2018 was a dire time in San Francisco anyway, but like it was a really dire initial proposal for this thing.
So like tech dorms,
basically, yeah,
which were built in the Tenderloin. There is a company called Star City that erected a building or two full of tech dorms, which, yeah, like you said, they're like single room occupancy with shared bathrooms, and they can go for up to like a couple $1,000 a month. And it's a way to pack people in who generally are going to be in the area just temporarily, and obviously have to be making a good amount of money to be able to afford these single rooms. Because of the tech exodus, like starting with COVID and people working from home and some of the tech companies leaving the city having, approved all of these single room occupancy units for rich people, we're left with a lot of, that's where a lot of the empty condos and empty apartments in new buildings are coming from. It's because the city was basically approving these developer proposals for, I guess, the most attractive type of person, the 20-something tech worker who has no family and is down to live in a dorm-like atmosphere.
I mean, I don't know what the covenants looked like or what the rental agreements would have looked like for that kind of thing. But like, imagine how many of those would have actually ended up being like either approved as Airbnbs or illegally like rented out as Airbnbs anyway, because it's the prime spot for that kind of thing.
Yeah. And actually HQ, this huge like weathered steel exterior building in Soma across from the Eagle, is one of the first complexes in the world, because Airbnb, of course, was founded here in San Francisco, that partnered with Airbnb to offer Airbnb as a, quote, amenity. So Airbnb has a dedicated web page for, I don't know if people say web page anymore, but where people who own some of the units at HQ can very easily put them on online and up for rent. So it's like intricately tied up with like the home sharing industry, I suppose.
Yeah, economy. What are we? I don't know what we're supposed to say about it anymore.
Right. We, at the time in 2018, we spoke with Scott Peterson, who was the general manager of Powerhouse, which is one of the last remaining leather bars in the city that's been in Soma for now 25 years. And I was wondering, Cole, if you could sum up what Peterson and then later Dan Van Lars said for the piece we wrote.
Totally. Peterson had a really interesting take for me because like it was very clear when we spoke to him that like he understood that like gentrification in the space had like cut down on the types of like what I think like the existing Eagle Plaza like board of directors people who are made up of administrators and like managers from Folsom Street Events, Mr. S Leather, the Eagle, and then a bunch of homeowners and homeowners associations that like are located in the block, who are almost exclusively made up of people who have like purchased homes in the last 15 to 20 years, like, and so they're not the old school residents of Soma. He understood that like increased surveillance and like increased like police presence and even just like basic things like better like lighting infrastructure in the area had like really cut down on like the type of activity that had made the space famous in the first place, like being naked outside, sex in small places, sex in alleys, like people hooking up in various locations. Like I guess that at this point, Powerhouse is also maybe one of the only places where that can still really occur because they have a tiny little like I'm sure illegal. And sorry to put them on blast, but like a illegal patio space in the back where you can like drink and smoke and fuck. He understood what was happening, but also like everyone who we spoke to, specifically like Peterson and Van Lars, who were Lars, who's like a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which is like a pretty famous like group of like drag performers in San Francisco who do a significant amount of work, like who have done a significant amount of work, like both raising money for HIV and like other gay and for gay homeless youth and in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and I think generally internationally at this point. They like understood that what they were doing and like by engaging with this project as part of like the Leather District was to try to carve out a little bit of space in what was left. But to me, it like largely kind of felt a bit fatalist because they were like, well, this is going this way and we'd like to like maintain what we've got. And so like, if we can just like stake out a claim through this process, we're going to be able to like protect what we have. Which I do understand to a degree. I mean, like the Eagle had gone through like at least 2 ownership changes in the last 10 years before that. And at the moment that we wrote this article was like still not entirely sure that like even with Eagle Plaza coming up, they weren't sure that the new owners were going to be able to make it work from like on an investment level, regardless of how many people show up to gay bars. There are only so many of us. And so it is, unless there's some really specific ways, it is difficult. I'm sure it's difficult to turn like the type of profit that you're looking for all the time, but like still like, it was one of those things where they were very much indicating like Van Lars even said, I think it was like, there was like the quote, like last chance unquote for like the leather community to maintain, actually like kind of carve out and maintain a presence in the neighborhood in Soma. I think a lot of them thought that like, and were hoping that at least the folks from like the Eagle and Powerhouse and like other institutions that were not under like the most dire of pressure to be like displaced and evicted or closed down, they were just hoping that like some kind of like formal recognition was going to be able to like make it possible for them to stay. Who knows what that actually would mean? I actually think that because the cultural distance ordinance, like the actual one was when they actually passed the culture, like the formalization of cultural districts in San Francisco, that was in 2018, earlier in 2018, right? Like, so it was really, really novel at the time.
Yeah.
The other thing that I remember them talking about was like, it was so much of it was wrapped up in Folsom, like the actual event. Like, I think that I remember also like they were really, really nervous about like what would happen to this massive thing. And this was a thing that they like, I don't think we actually quoted any of these pieces, but that they all touched on. They were like, we're not sure what will happen to these events if we aren't able to make nice with both the city and the new homeowners and like rich tenants who have moved into the neighborhood, who are like, not to say that none of them are attendees to this type of stuff, but like it's not like a bunch of like families with like young children who like have money are gonna be like super happy that like the new, like the fully renovated, like, you know, 3-story home that they purchased in Soma is like for 3 weekends a year just absolutely surrounded by like naked people fucking, like, and and a couple blocks over, like pissing on each other in like, kiddie pools and stuff, which is the primary thing that happens in at 3 a.m.
Right.
Which is like, I mean, which is like what I would like, which is what they're there for. I mean, that's the whole point of them. But I do think that that's part of like, in addition to like being scared about like the market pressures of gentrification, they were also really nervous about like the actual like sexual components and like gay and leather based and kink components of their businesses, which were so core to the clientele who attend there, that those were going to be like shut down by things like noise complaints or like super frictious relationships with like local neighborhood homeowners associations. And so by like trying to get in bed with the business improvement aspects of the thing, which was something that almost everyone who was at a higher level that was not part of the SEDS co-op was like part of like fostering and like building a connection with like what still had not yet become like the Western Settlement, like community business district. So like I remember that was like a lot of what they were talking about. I remember Van Laar specifically like was talking about like the possibility of like the district mandating that like condo lease agreements like discourage new neighbors from complaining about late night noise. Like I don't know if that's happened. I'm doubtful that that has happened. I don't think that you actually could do that without something from like the planning department, which would have to go through like city council. But
yeah, I think it was like the developer is supposed to educate people moving into the neighborhood and like let them know that there might be parties. It's a city here and people might be out past 9 p.m. And so to kind of expect that and to ask new homeowners or people moving into the apartments to like sign some kind of agreement saying like, yeah, we'll respect that this is the culture here. We won't necessarily be like calling 311 or 911 every time we hear like house music playing past 9 p.m.
Which is truly nuts when you actually think about, because we actually spoke to like Brooke Ray Rivera, who's an urban planner and the director of a place called Place Lab, which is like the nonprofit wing of like the development group called Build Inc., which is like a pretty prolific real estate company that was kind of in charge of like designing and and building Eagle Plaza and then the HQ building like next to it, like kind of doing the design plans, and then they weren't the actual developers of the building, but they were like the one in charge of like doing the initial designs. And when we spoke to her, I mean, she was wild to talk to, honestly. That I was really shocked because it was obviously that like whatever briefs she had gotten were very different from whatever the business and managers who we had spoken to from like the Eagle and from Powerhouse were actually like idealizing the place for me. Because she described like, and you can actually see this, and I think they're still online, like the rendering. Yeah, because it goes from the start of our piece, like the renderings of Eagle Plaza. Like there are strollers there. She described it as a European style piazza. Like there are many children, children, great, love children in the city. But like the other things that she said that like the rich people who are going to move into the condos were going to be like activators for the area, and that their presence was going to do things like this is an actual quote, discourage antisocial behavior, unquote. She also described things as like the new plaza, like specifically as like quote family friendly, unquote, and then quote G-rated, unquote.
Right.
Specific and she, unprompted by either of us, like she said that the rest of the neighborhood like was largely like a needle fest, which I found insane. I was like, okay, so like, this is what you see like from the rest of the space, and like this is the development, and she's not just talking, right? I mean, obviously, I think she's a Bay Area resident or in Los Angeles, so she had like a first person relationship with the space at the very least, but like that was the brief that she had gotten for development, like, and that is not anything like what Scott Pearson or Van Laars or any of the other folks who were on the like local business or like local kink and gay infrastructure of the space were talking to us about.
I mean, her job is to do public relations. Like her job is to do marketing for the new condos, and it's weird that, I don't know, like she didn't hold back saying like, this neighborhood is disgusting. You need these G-rated makeovers of all of the public space to happen before it's, a place that anybody would ever want to go. As we've talked about, there were already people living in the area.
I think that's something that goes really like that. I remember your like hairs went up immediately when we had her stuff when her quotes came in, because it was like you had been doing a lot of work on like business improvement districts and like the ways that they had like increased both like surveillance and police presence in a lot of areas. And like one of the primary goals of especially the homeowners who were involved. And I remember when we cross-referenced a lot of this stuff, like the people who were like the homeowners association representatives on the Friends of Eagle Plaza section, like they overlapped pretty closely with people who were involved in like the push for like Tenderloin and Soma based community improvement districts. And like they were sometimes the people who did the block walking when the police officers weren't there, who called the cops. And I'm not actually sure exactly what the situation is on that part, like that part of like market is now in regards to homelessness. But when I was living in the city, like that was a major encampment area. Like, and so, and like on a weekly basis, people would be removed up and down. And it's not like the folks who were involved with some of the like Folsom based events were also like fully innocent of this. It's like, I mean, people got, in order to spray the streets down before the festival, people actually got like violently removed from their tents and like their encampments on an annual basis. Like, I mean, Ringgold Alley even like is a place where at that time in the city, people would set up at the at both ends of it, really trying hard to like keep it together and stay somewhere in the neighborhood close to social services. And I just remember repeatedly like they got moved all of the time for various things, like gay or not,
Yeah, the Folsom Street Fair, like you said, doing these sweeps prior to the days in September when the fair goes on. It's, now like a huge tourism event for the city, and the city has, it's like warehouse of leather flags that it attaches to light poles every September. And now, they're intimately intertwined with the city mega structure.
I think one of the things that was really rough was, when we wrote this, there had just been a ton of city funding mechanisms that had been passed at the ballot. I think Prop E had come in, and then Prop C, which hadn't passed yet. Which were seeking to produce what is nominally called affordable housing in this country and the city. And I think that there were so many hopes pinned on that as part of the structure for keeping things together. And it's just really none of that has happened at scale that's going to make any difference.
These were small taxes that were basically taxes on the rich.
E was a hotel tax, and then C was a tax on small tax on businesses that make $50K or more annually, I think, in profit.
Yeah. And having this real estate friendly and police friendly mayor made it harder for that funding to actually make it into the budget that the city is going to spend on affordable housing. Totally an example of administrative violence that friend of the podcast, Dean Spade, talks about in his book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence and the Limits of the Law. Just the harm that formalized regulations can do to people on purpose or not. But in this case, I mean, the propositions that you mentioned, ostensibly these were supposed to, with small taxes, produce a lot more in terms of units of affordable housing that were available to people. And it just hasn't. I mean, we know that these things take a while to generate the actual housing. The construction of them can take years. We have a very conservative bureaucracy that own the city hall currently, and as much as they can, they are holding out on building more deeply affordable housing, if you want to call it deeply affordable housing, or just very, very low income housing or free housing.
You have to even get it out of the general fund, because London Breed wants to turn it into what now? She wants to use the funds for like more shelter beds rather than actual housing. So
right. There's like a whole story there, because it's like Urban Alchemy, which is like this proto-policing organization that is running a lot of the shelters now. Like these contracts for close to $100 million the city will have spent on its contract with Urban Alchemy pretty soon. And in that case, it's like the person who runs Urban Alchemy is the ex of London Breed's ex, Mohammed Nuru, who is now in prison for bribery and corruption charges. He was like handing over these contracts to companies that stood to make and are making a lot of money off of things like these temporary shelter beds that are not there. You know, these aren't homes. These aren't like places where people can gain like stability in their lives. And they're just temporary structures that keep getting moved. Somebody's making money off of the deconstruction and reconstruction of these like temporary shelters.
And even when housing is built, I mean, we saw from the Harvard's like Joint Center for Housing Studies report this year that like over 50% of of housing that's being built, which we're building the most housing we've ever built in this country in a long time, is being built for like what is explicitly luxury, and not just like subjectively luxury, like for people who make enough money to actually have luxury apartments, like which are basically just like capital sinks. It's like, if that's what 50% of buildings is right now, then there's not, even those people who claim there's going to be trickle down effects from that, it would never get there, because if you're not actually building in any of that so-called missing middle housing, you can't trickle down to anything at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because this is housing that's ostensibly never going to trickle down. This is the cost the most rentals and luxury condos that, even if like with the EMB line being that like in 30 years, yeah, things could trickle down to where housing that's built market rate today could be affordable for low income people in the future. 30 years is the figure that was told to me by a prominent EMB. 30 years is a long time to wait.
We talked to Tara Haywood to kind of close off our piece, and Tara is a member of the Stud Co-op. The Stud, which in the time since we've written this piece is no longer a bar and is just, I think, throws events in the city from time to time. Their old space has been painted over with its lovely murals and now sits there as a place where their somewhat nebulous owner is eventually gonna sell it for a big profit, probably to turn it over into the types of housing that we've been discussing already. It's like, I mean, she told us that like the idea was that like that she just wants queer and leather people to be able to stay in the neighborhood. And as we've seen in San Francisco, like between 80 and 90% of people who are homeless in the city were displaced from homes in the city. And it's like, so the people who are homeless and being subjected to these sweeps are just former queer and leather residents in the neighborhood. And it's like, there are some clear answers for what to do, but I don't think any of them involve forming committees with local homeowners who have recently purchased multi-million-dollar appreciable homes, and then, like local businesses. That's not going to fix it.
Are you working on anything you'd like to plug? And if you would be down for people to find you or follow you online, where you might be found?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at dare4$. Otherwise, I'm getting a special ed master's, so I'm not doing anything fun or out in the world right now. My primary work is trying to organize my apartment building. So.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. The podcast is produced by Toshio, Meronek, and Caitlin Wood. If you like it, please go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco for more.